Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone screen. The numbers didn't lie. $47.23. That was all he had until Friday, and today was only Tuesday. He let out a long breath and tossed the phone onto his pillow. The apartment was quiet. His roommate had already left for his morning classes. Daniel looked around the small room they shared, taking in the peeling paint on the walls and the second-hand furniture they'd picked up from various yard sales. The place wasn't much, but it was home. More importantly, it was all he could afford while trying to finish his business degree. He walked to the tiny kitchenette and opened the cupboard. 3 packets of instant noodles stared back at him. In the fridge, there was half a carton of milk that would expire tomorrow and some leftover rice from 2 days ago. Daniel had become an expert at stretching every dollar, every meal, every resource he had. His stomach growled, reminding him that he'd skipped dinner last night to save money. He grabbed the instant coffee jar from the counter. It was nearly empty, just a few spoonfuls left at the bottom. He'd been drinking this cheap stuff for so long that he'd almost forgotten what real coffee tasted like. As he made his morning coffee, his mind wandered to his mother. She was working 2 jobs back in their hometown, still trying to pay off the medical bills from when his younger sister had gotten sick 3 years ago. Daniel had offered to drop out and help, but his mom wouldn't hear it. She'd worked her entire life cleaning houses and waiting tables so he could be the first in their family to get a college degree. That's why he couldn't fail. That's why he worked 25 hours a week at the campus library while maintaining straight A's. That's why he lived on instant noodles and walked everywhere instead of taking the bus. Every sacrifice brought him closer to graduating, closer to getting a real job, closer to helping his family instead of being a burden. Daniel checked his watch. He had exactly 2 hours before his shift at the library started. But today was different. Today was important. Today he had an interview that could change everything. For the past 4 months, he'd been applying to every job posting he could find. Entry-level positions, internships, anything that would give him a foot in the door. Most companies never responded. A few sent polite rejection emails. But 3 weeks ago, he'd received a call from Wellington and Associates, one of the biggest consulting firms in the city. They wanted to interview him. Daniel had nearly dropped his phone when the recruiter called. Wellington and Associates was the kind of company people dreamed about working for. They handled major corporate clients, worked on projects that made the news, and paid salaries that seemed impossible to someone like him. He'd applied on a whim, never actually believing he'd hear back. Since getting that call, he'd spent every free moment preparing. He'd borrowed books about consulting from the library. He'd watched every video he could find about interview techniques. He'd practiced answering common questions in front of his bathroom mirror until his roommate started making jokes about him talking to himself. The interview was scheduled for 11 o'clock. Daniel had carefully planned his morning. He would go to campus early, use the library computers to review his notes one more time, and then take the subway downtown. He'd budgeted exactly $12 for the round trip, a bottle of water, and maybe a granola bar if he could find one cheap enough. But as he finished his instant coffee, staring at the bitter, watery drink, something shifted inside him. He'd been living on the edge for so long, denying himself every small pleasure, every tiny comfort. What if, just this once, he did something different? What if he bought himself a real cup of coffee before the biggest interview of his life? The idea felt almost rebellious. $6 for a coffee was usually unthinkable. That was 2 meals. That was a used textbook from the discount bin. That was half of his weekly grocery budget. But today felt special. Today felt like it deserved something special. Daniel looked at his only suit hanging on the back of the door. He'd bought it from a thrift store 2 years ago for $15. It was a bit too big in the shoulders and slightly worn at the elbows, but it was clean and professional. He'd pressed it himself last night using the iron he shared with 3 other people on his floor. He made his decision. He would get a real coffee this morning. Just this once. An hour later, Daniel stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time. His hair was neatly combed. His shoes were polished as well as they could be given their age. And he'd even managed to print 5 copies of his resume at the library yesterday. He looked professional. He looked ready. The walk to campus took 15 minutes. The morning air was crisp and the streets were busy with people heading to work. Daniel watched them pass by, men and women in expensive suits carrying leather briefcases. talking on phones that probably cost more than he made in a month. Someday he thought that would be him. The coffee shop near campus was a local place called Riverside Cafe. It was nothing fancy, but it was popular with students who had money to spend on things like $4 lattes and $5 breakfast sandwiches. Daniel had walked past it hundreds of times, always keeping his eyes straight ahead, never letting himself think about what he was missing. Today, he walked in. The smell hit him immediately. Real coffee, freshly brewed, mixed with the scent of pastries and warm bread. His stomach reminded him again that he was hungry, but he pushed the feeling aside. He was here for coffee, nothing more. The line moved slowly. Daniel stood behind a woman ordering some complicated drink with extra foam and caramel drizzle. Behind him, more people filed in, the shop filling up with the morning rush. He studied the menu board, trying to decide what to order. Everything seemed expensive, but he'd already committed to this small luxury. When it was finally his turn, he stepped up to the counter. The barista, a young guy probably around his age, smiled and asked what he wanted. "Just a medium coffee," Daniel said. "Black, please." "That'll be $4.75. Daniel pulled out a crumpled $5 bill from his wallet and handed it over. He received his quarter in change and stepped aside to wait. As he stood there, he calculated the new balance in his head. $42.48 until Friday. He could make that work. He'd done more with less. The barista called out his order and Daniel grabbed his coffee. He wrapped both hands around the paper cup, feeling its warmth. This was it. This was his one indulgence before the interview that could change his life. He found a small table by the window and sat down, taking his first sip. It was good. Really good. Nothing like the instant coffee he'd been drinking for months. He could taste the difference, feel the difference. For just a moment, sitting in that coffee shop with his real coffee and his press suit, Daniel let himself imagine what life might be like if he got this job. Real paychecks. The ability to buy groceries without counting every penny, maybe even helping his mom pay off some of those medical bills. He checked his phone. 9:30. He had plenty of time before he needed to head downtown. He took another sip of his coffee and pulled out his folder of interview notes. He'd review everything one more time, make sure he was as prepared as possible. This was his chance. This was what all the sacrifices had been for. The instant noodles, the secondhand clothes, the walks in the rain because he couldn't afford the bus. All of it had led to this moment. Daniel took a deep breath and started reading through his notes, his real coffee growing slowly cooler on the table in front of him. Whatever happened in that interview room today, at least he'd given himself this one small thing. At least he'd allowed himself to feel just for a moment, like someone who deserved good things. He had no idea that his morning was about to take a turn he could never have expected. He had no idea that the next person to walk through that coffee shop door would change everything. Daniel was halfway, through his third page of notes, when the door to the coffee shop swung open with more force than necessary. He glanced up just for a second and saw a man rushing in. The guy was probably in his 50s, wearing a suit that even Daniel could tell was expensive. Everything about him screamed success, from his perfectly styled gray hair to his leather shoes that probably cost more than Daniel's entire wardrobe. The man moved quickly to the counter, already pulling out his phone to check something. He seemed stressed, the kind of stress that came from having too many important things happening at once. Daniel went back to his notes, trying to focus on the key points he wanted to make about his senior project. "I'll have a large Americano, double shot," the man said to the barista. His voice was confident, used to giving orders and having them followed. There was a pause. Daniel kept his eyes on his paper, but he could hear the conversation clearly. "That'll be $5.50, the barista said. Another pause. This one longer. The man's voice changed, losing some of that confidence. "I think I left my wallet in the car." Daniel looked up. The man was patting his jacket pockets, then his pants pockets, a look of genuine frustration crossing his face. He checked his jacket again as if his wallet might magically appear on the second search. "I'm so sorry," the man said, pulling out his phone. "I could use Apple Pay if you—" "Our system's down for that right now," the barista said, looking apologetic. "It's been acting up all morning. Cash or card only?" The man glanced at his watch, a nice piece that caught the light. He looked like someone who had somewhere important to be and didn't have time for this kind of inconvenience. "Look, my car's just 2 blocks away. I can run and—" He checked his watch again, and Daniel could see the calculation happening in his head. Whatever he was rushing to, he clearly didn't have time to run 2 blocks there and back. Daniel had been watching this unfold for maybe 30 seconds. The logical part of his brain was telling him to stay out of it, to keep his head down, to focus on his interview prep. He had $42 to last him 3 more days. He couldn't afford to be generous. He couldn't afford to help strangers in coffee shops. But something else was happening inside him. Something that had nothing to do with logic or budgets or careful planning. He thought about his mom, working 2 jobs, still somehow finding money to send him $20 here and there, even though he always told her not to. He thought about his sister, who'd shared her lunch with a homeless kid at her school, even when they barely had enough themselves. He thought about all the times people had helped his family when they needed it most. Before he could talk himself out of it, Daniel stood up and walked to the counter. "I've got it," he said. The man turned, looking surprised. Up close, Daniel could see the fine lines around his eyes, the expensive watch more clearly, the quality of his suit's fabric. This was someone who lived in a completely different world. "You don't have to," the man started. "It's just coffee," Daniel said, pulling out his wallet. He tried to make his voice casual, like $6 wasn't a calculation he'd have to work into his budget for the rest of the week. He handed the barista a $10 bill, the only bill he had in his wallet besides a few ones. The change would be important. Every dollar mattered. "I really appreciate this," the man said, and Daniel could hear genuine gratitude in his voice. "This is very kind of you." "No problem," Daniel said, taking his change from the barista. $4.50. He tucked it carefully into his wallet. "Please let me get your name," the man said. "I'd like to pay you back." "Really, it's okay," Daniel said. "We've all forgotten our wallets before." That wasn't entirely true. Daniel never forgot his wallet because his wallet barely had anything to forget, but the man didn't need to know that. The barista called out the Americano and the man grabbed it, but instead of rushing out like Daniel expected, he gestured to Daniel's table. "Do you have a minute? I'd at least like to say thank you properly." Daniel glanced at his phone. 9:45, he still had time before he needed to head downtown. "Sure," he said. They walked back to Daniel's small table by the window. The man sat down across from him, and Daniel quickly gathered his interview notes, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the whole situation. "I'm James," the man said, extending his hand. "Daniel." They shook hands. James had the kind of firm handshake that business books always talked about. "So Daniel, thank you again. I've been running from meeting to meeting all morning, and I guess in the rush I left my wallet on my desk." He took a sip of his coffee and seemed to relax slightly. "You're a student?" Daniel glanced down at his notes, which he hadn't quite managed to hide completely. "Yeah, senior year, business major." "Good choice," James said. "What area are you interested in?" This was the kind of conversation Daniel usually loved, talking about business strategy and management theory. But right now, with his interview in just over an hour, he felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. "Consulting, actually," Daniel said. "I like the idea of working with different companies, solving different problems. Keeps things interesting." James nodded, looking genuinely interested. "That's a smart perspective. A lot of people go into consulting for the wrong reasons, prestige or money. But the ones who really succeed are the ones who love the variety, the problem-solving aspect." He paused. "You have interviews lined up?" "Actually, yeah. I have one this morning. That's why I'm here so early, trying to review everything one last time." "Nervous?" "Terrified," Daniel admitted with a small laugh. "It's a big company, way bigger than I probably have any business interviewing with, but I figured why not try?" "That's the right attitude," James said. "I've been in business for 30 years, and I can tell you that attitude matters more than most people realize. Half the battle is just being willing to walk through the door." They talked for a few more minutes. James asked about Daniel's studies, what classes he'd enjoyed most, what kind of projects he'd worked on. Daniel found himself relaxing, talking about the senior thesis he'd written on sustainable business practices, the group project where they'd developed a marketing strategy for a local nonprofit. "You know what I find interesting?" James said, leaning back in his chair. A lot of young people today, they focus so much on the technical skills, the hard knowledge. And that's important, don't get me wrong, but they forget about character, about integrity. Those things matter just as much, maybe more. Daniel thought about the $6 he'd just spent, the mental recalculation of his budget he'd have to do later. I think character is tested most when you don't have much to give, he said. It's easy to be generous when you're wealthy. It's harder when you're counting pennies. James looked at him with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. That's a wise observation. Where'd you learn that? From my mom mostly, Daniel said. She raised my sister and me on a waitress's salary. We never had much, but she always taught us that what you have doesn't define who you are. How you treat people does. Your mom sounds like a remarkable woman. She is. James checked his watch and stood up. I really do need to get going, but Daniel, thank you again, not just for the coffee, but for the conversation. You've actually made my morning better, despite the wallet situation. Good luck with your meetings, Daniel said, standing as well. They shook hands again and James headed for the door. He paused with his hand on the handle and turned back. Hey Daniel, that interview you have this morning, where is it? Wellington and Associates, it's a consulting firm downtown. Something changed in James's expression. But it was so quick that Daniel couldn't identify what it was. Surprise? Amusement? Something else? Well, James said, a slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Good luck with that. I'm sure you'll do great. And then he was gone, pushing through the door and disappearing into the stream of people on the sidewalk. Daniel sat back down, his coffee now cold. He checked his phone again. 10 o'clock. He needed to leave in about 15 minutes to make sure he got to the interview with time to spare. He looked at his notes, but he wasn't really seeing them anymore. That had been a strange encounter. Nice, but strange. James had seemed like a good guy, successful obviously, but also genuinely interested in their conversation. It wasn't often that someone like that took the time to sit and talk with a broke college student. Daniel finished the last of his cold coffee and gathered his things. He folded his notes carefully and put them in his folder with his resume copies. He checked his appearance one more time in his phone's camera, making sure his tie was straight and his hair was still neat. The walk to the subway felt longer than usual. Daniel's mind was racing, running through potential interview questions and his prepared answers. He thought about James's words, about attitude and character mattering as much as skills and knowledge. He hoped that was true. He hoped that who he was would be enough to make up for where he came from. The subway was crowded with morning commuters. Daniel stood holding onto a pole, his folder clutched under his arm. He watched the stops pass by, getting closer to downtown, closer to the interview, closer to whatever was about to happen. He had no idea that James, the man whose coffee he'd just bought, was on his way to the exact same building. He had no idea that their paths were about to cross again in the most unexpected way possible. He had no idea that his simple act of kindness, that $6 decision that had seemed so insignificant, was about to change the entire trajectory of his life. All Daniel knew was that he had an interview in 45 minutes and he needed to be ready. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. Whatever happened next, he was as prepared as he could be. The rest was out of his hands. The subway pulled into his stop, and Daniel stepped out onto the platform, joining the flow of people heading up the stairs toward the street. The Wellington and Associates building was just 3 blocks away. He checked his phone one more time. 10:35. Perfect timing. He started walking, his heart pounding in his chest, completely unaware that his morning was about to take a turn he could never have imagined. The Wellington and Associates building was impossible to miss. It rose, 30 stories into the sky, all glass and steel reflecting the morning sun like something out of a magazine. Daniel stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just looking up at it. This was the kind of building he'd walked past 100 times, never imagining he'd actually have a reason to go inside. The lobby was massive, with marble floors that echoed with every footstep and a ceiling that seemed to stretch up forever. There were modern art pieces on the walls, leather seating areas where well-dressed people sat with their laptops, and a security desk manned by 2 guards in crisp uniforms. Daniel approached the desk, trying to look more confident than he felt. "I have an interview at Wellington and Associates," he said. 11 o'clock. The security guard, an older man with kind eyes, checked his computer. "Name, Daniel Chen." "Ah, yes, here you are. They're on the 15th floor. Elevators are to your right. You'll need to check in with reception when you get up there." "Thank you." The elevator was just as impressive as everything else, with polished mirrors and soft lighting. Daniel rode up with 3 other people, all of them looking like they belonged in a place like this. He caught his reflection in the mirror and straightened his tie again. His suit looked even more worn and cheap in this environment, but there was nothing he could do about that now. The doors opened on the 15th floor, and Daniel stepped out into another impressive space. The Wellington and Associates logo was mounted on the wall behind a sleek reception desk, and through glass walls, he could see office spaces and conference rooms filled with people who looked busy and important. The receptionist, a woman in her 30s with perfect makeup and a friendly smile, looked up as he approached. "Good morning."
How can I help you?
"I'm Daniel Chen. I have an 11 o'clock interview." She typed something into her computer. "Perfect. You're right on time. If you could just sign in here and take a seat, someone will be with you shortly." Daniel signed the visitor log and took a seat in the waiting area. The chairs were more comfortable than any furniture he owned. There were magazines on the coffee table, business publications and industry journals. He picked one up but couldn't focus on the words. 2 other people were already sitting in the waiting area. One was a woman about his age, wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. She was reviewing something on her tablet, looking completely calm and collected. The other was a man, maybe a few years older, who kept checking his phone with an expression that suggested he had better places to be. Daniel felt out of place. These people looked like they belonged here. They looked like success. He probably looked like someone who'd accidentally wandered in from the street. At 10:55, the woman with the tablet was called back for her interview. At 11:05, the man with the phone followed. Neither of them had been gone very long before returning and leaving. Daniel couldn't read their expressions to tell if things had gone well or poorly. At 11:15, when Daniel was starting to wonder if they'd forgotten about him, a young man in a sharp suit appeared. "Daniel Chen?" "Yes." Daniel stood up, folder in hand. "Hi, I'm Robert, one of the senior associates here. Sorry for the wait. We're running a bit behind this morning. If you'll follow me." They walked down a corridor lined with glass-walled offices. Daniel could see people inside, some on phone calls, others working at computers, a few in meetings. Everyone looked busy, purposeful, like they were doing things that mattered. "Have you been waiting long?" Robert asked, making small talk as they walked. "Not too bad. About 20 minutes. Good. So you're finishing up your business degree?" "That's right. I graduate in May." "Excellent. We see a lot of candidates from your university." "Good program." They turned a corner and Robert stopped in front of a conference room. Through the glass wall, Daniel could see a table with several people already seated. His heart started pounding harder. "Okay, so the format today is pretty straightforward," Robert said. "We have a panel of 4 interviewers. They'll ask you some questions about your background, your experience, and we'll do a case study exercise. Should take about an hour, maybe a bit less. Sound good?" "Sounds great," Daniel said, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. Robert opened the door and gestured for Daniel to enter. "Everyone, this is Daniel Chen. Daniel, have a seat right there at the end." Daniel walked in, very aware of the folder in his hands, the worn elbows of his jacket, the shoes that he'd polished as well as he could but were still clearly old. 4 people sat along one side of the conference table, all of them looking professional and intimidating. But as Daniel pulled out the chair and started to sit down, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. At the head of the table, in the obvious position of authority, sat James, the man from the coffee shop. The man whose coffee he'd bought less than 2 hours ago. Daniel froze halfway into his chair, his mind spinning. James was here. James was part of his interview panel. James was... And then Daniel's eyes moved to the nameplate sitting on the table in front of James's position. It wasn't just James. It was James Wellington. As in Wellington and Associates, as in the founder of the entire company. Daniel's hands went numb. He felt like he might be sick. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of setup, some kind of test. Had James known who Daniel was this morning? Had the whole wallet thing been staged? Was this some elaborate interview technique? James's expression was unreadable, professional, giving nothing away. He looked exactly like what he was, a CEO about to conduct an interview. "Mr. Chen," James said, his voice formal, betraying no hint of their earlier encounter. "Thank you for joining us today. Please have a seat." Daniel sat down mechanically, his mind still reeling. He put his folder on the table, trying to remember how to breathe normally. James gestured to the others at the table. "Let me introduce our panel. This is Patricia Wu, our Director of Human Resources. Next to her is David Kim, one of our senior partners, and this is Michelle Torres, who leads our Analyst Development Program." He paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing. "And I'm James Wellington, founder and CEO of Wellington & Associates." Each person nodded as they were introduced. Daniel tried to focus, tried to look at each of them and appear professional, but his eyes kept being drawn back to James. "Before we begin," James said, and now Daniel detected something in his voice, the tiniest hint of warmth that hadn't been there before. "I need to mention something to the panel." Daniel's stomach dropped. Here it came. James was going to explain about the coffee shop, and everyone would know that Daniel had tried to buy his way into this interview, or they'd think he'd been manipulating the situation, or, "Mr. Chen and I had a brief encounter this morning," James said, looking directly at Daniel now. "I'd left my wallet in my car and couldn't pay for my coffee. Daniel here, not knowing who I was, offered to pay for it." Patricia looked interested. David raised an eyebrow. Michelle smiled slightly. "I wanted to disclose that up front," James continued, "because it's relevant to my assessment. But I also want to assure everyone, including Daniel, that this interview will be conducted fairly and professionally. The fact that he showed kindness to a stranger this morning won't negatively or positively impact our hiring decision. We're going to evaluate him on his qualifications, just like any other candidate. Is that clear?" Everyone nodded. Daniel managed to nod as well, though he wasn't sure his brain was fully processing what was happening. "Good," James said. "Then let's begin. Daniel, why don't you start by telling us a bit about yourself and why you're interested in consulting?" This was it. The question Daniel had practiced 100 times. He opened his mouth and somehow, miraculously, words came out. Professional words. Coherent words. "I'm a senior at State University, majoring in business administration with a focus on strategic management. I first became interested in consulting during an internship I did with a small firm last summer." As Daniel spoke, he felt himself settling into the familiar rhythm of his prepared answer. He talked about his coursework, his projects, his interest in problem-solving. The panel listened attentively, occasionally making notes. Patricia asked the next question. "Tell us about a time when you had to work with a difficult team member. How did you handle it?" Daniel thought for a moment, then launched into a story about his senior thesis group, about the team member who'd missed deadlines and how Daniel had worked to understand what was going on in his life, rather than just being angry about it. David asked about his analytical skills. Michelle asked about his leadership experience. The questions kept coming, and somehow Daniel kept answering them. He found his rhythm, his confidence starting to build despite the surreal situation. But James, sitting at the head of the table, barely said anything. He just watched, his expression neutral, his eyes sharp and assessing. It was impossible to tell what he was thinking. After about 30 minutes of questions, James finally spoke up. "Let's move on to the case study portion. Daniel, we're going to present you with a business scenario, and we'd like you to walk us through how you'd approach it." David slid a folder across the table. "Take a few minutes to read through this. It's a real case we worked on last year, though we've changed the names and some details for confidentiality." Daniel opened the folder. Inside was a description of a mid-sized manufacturing company, facing declining profits and increasing competition. There were financial statements, market analysis, and information about the company's operations. He read through it carefully, his mind shifting into analysis mode. This was something he was good at, something he'd practiced. He started seeing patterns, identifying problems, formulating solutions. After about 5 minutes, James spoke. "Okay, Daniel, walk us through your initial assessment. What are the key issues you see?" Daniel took a breath and began. He talked about the company's cost structure, about their marketing strategy, about operational inefficiencies he'd noticed in the data. He suggested areas for investigation, questions that would need to be answered, potential solutions that might work. The panel listened intently. David asked a follow-up question about one of Daniel's suggestions. Michelle challenged his assumption about the market data. Daniel responded to each question, defending his reasoning but also showing he could adapt when presented with new information. And through it all, James watched. Sometimes he would nod slightly. Sometimes he would make a note. But mostly he just listened, his face giving away nothing. After about 45 minutes, James looked at his watch and then at the rest of the panel. I think we've covered the case study thoroughly. Does anyone have additional questions for Daniel? Patricia shook her head. David looked through his notes but said, No, I think we're good. Michelle smiled at Daniel. I think we've learned quite a bit. Thank you for your thoughtful responses. James stood up and everyone else followed suit. Daniel gathered his folder, unsure what to do next. The interview was over. He'd survived it, but he had no idea if he'd done well or if the whole coffee shop incident had just made everything awkward and cost him the job. Thank you for coming in, Daniel, James said, extending his hand. We appreciate your time. They shook hands and Daniel tried to read anything in James's expression, but the CEO's face remained professionally neutral. We have a few more candidates to interview this week, Patricia explained, walking Daniel toward the door. We'll be making our decisions by the end of next week and we'll reach out to all candidates at that time. Thank you, Daniel said. I really appreciate the opportunity. Robert appeared to walk Daniel back to the elevators. As they left the conference room, Daniel glanced back one more time. James was talking with David, already moving on to whatever was next in his busy day. It was like the coffee shop had never happened. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up. Robert made small talk about the weather, about traffic, about nothing that mattered. Daniel responded automatically, his mind still trying to process everything that had just happened. What were the chances? What were the actual mathematical chances that the stranger he'd bought coffee for would turn out to be the CEO of the company he was interviewing with? It seemed impossible, like something from a movie. And more importantly, had it helped or hurt him? James had said it wouldn't factor into the decision. But how could it not? Would the other panelists think Daniel had been trying to manipulate the situation? Would they wonder if James was showing favoritism? Take care, Robert said as they reached the lobby. Good luck. Thanks, Daniel said. He walked out of the building into the afternoon sun. The street was busy with lunch crowds, people streaming in and out of restaurants and coffee shops. Daniel just stood there for a moment trying to figure out what to do next. His shift at the library didn't start until 3. He had 2 hours to kill, but going back to his apartment felt wrong. He needed to think, to process, to figure out what had just happened. He found a bench in a small plaza near the building and sat down. He pulled out his phone and stared at it. He wanted to call someone, to tell someone about this crazy morning, but who? His mom was at work, and the last thing she needed was him bothering her during her shift. His roommate wouldn't understand. His sister was in class. Daniel sat there alone, replaying every moment of the interview in his head. Had he answered the questions well? Had he made sense during the case study? Had he seemed professional despite the bizarre circumstances? And what about James? What was he thinking right now? Did he regret sitting in on the interview? Did he wish Daniel had never bought him that coffee? The more Daniel thought about it, the more convinced he became that he'd blown it. The coffee shop thing had been too weird, too coincidental. It would overshadow everything else. Even if James had liked his answers, even if the rest of the panel had been impressed, that strange connection would taint everything. Daniel checked his bank account on his phone. $36.48. He'd forgotten about the coffee. The $6 he'd spent that morning that had set all of this in motion. He let out a laugh that was almost a sob. $6 that might have cost him his dream job. But no, that wasn't fair. He'd made the choice to help someone, not expecting anything in return. That wasn't manipulation. That was just being a decent person. And if it cost him the job, then maybe this wasn't the right place for him anyway. Except he knew that wasn't true. He needed this job. He needed any job. And Wellington and Associates was the kind of opportunity that could change everything for him and his family. Daniel's phone buzzed. It was a text from his roommate asking if he wanted to split a pizza for dinner. Daniel did some quick math. Pizza would be about $8 for his half. He could make that work if he skipped breakfast tomorrow. He texted back, "Yeah, sure. Sounds good. At least that was something normal. Something that made sense in his world." Daniel spent the next hour and a half just sitting on that bench watching people pass by. Office workers on their lunch breaks, delivery drivers rushing to their next stop, tourists taking photos. Everyone had somewhere to be, something to do. Everyone's life was moving forward. Finally, at 2:30, he headed to campus for his library shift. The work was mindless, scanning books, helping students find materials, reshelving returned items. It gave his hands something to do while his mind continued to spin. His coworker, a sophomore named Alex, noticed his distraction. "You okay? You seem out of it." "Just had a weird morning," Daniel said, scanning another book. "Good weird or bad weird? Honestly, I have no idea." The days that followed were torture. Daniel went to classes, went to work, tried to focus on his final projects, but in the back of his mind always was the waiting to hear from Wellington and Associates, waiting to find out if he'd gotten the job, or if his one shot at a real opportunity had been ruined by a $6 cup of coffee. He thought about calling, about sending an email to ask about the timeline. But Patricia had said end of the week, and it was only Wednesday. He didn't want to seem desperate or pushy. Thursday passed. Then Friday. Daniel checked his email obsessively, his phone always in his hand. Nothing. By Friday evening, he'd convinced himself that the silence was his answer. They'd chosen someone else. Of course they had. Someone who hadn't had a weird encounter with the CEO before the interview. Someone who'd worn a better suit and had gone to a better school and had more impressive internships. He tried to push it out of his mind over the weekend. He had a paper due Monday and he needed to focus. But every time his phone buzzed, his heart would jump. And every time it was just a spam email or a text from a classmate, he felt the disappointment settle a little deeper. Monday morning came. Daniel dragged himself out of bed, made his instant coffee, and tried to psyche himself up for another week of classes and work and waiting to hear from all the other companies he'd applied to. He was brushing his teeth when his phone rang. An unknown number with a local area code. Daniel's heart stopped. He spit out the toothpaste and grabbed his phone. "Hello? Is this Daniel Chen?" It was a woman's voice, professional and polite. "Yes, this is Daniel." "Hi, Daniel, this is Patricia Wu from Wellington and Associates. Do you have a moment to talk?" Daniel's hand was shaking. "Yes, absolutely. Great, I'm calling about your interview last week. We've completed our candidate review process and I'm happy to tell you that we'd like to extend you an offer." The words didn't make sense at first. Daniel had been so convinced he hadn't gotten the job that his brain couldn't process what she was actually saying. "An offer?" he repeated stupidly. "Yes. We were very impressed with your interview, particularly your analytical approach to the case study and your thoughtful responses to our questions. We'd like to offer you a position in our analyst program, starting this July after your graduation." Thank you," Daniel stammered. "That's incredible. I'm going to send you an email with all the details, the salary information, benefits package, start date, all of that. Take some time to review it and we can set up a time to discuss any questions you might have." "Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. Congratulations, Daniel. We're looking forward to having you join the team." After Patricia hung up, Daniel just stood there in his bathroom, toothbrush in one hand, phone in the other, trying to comprehend what had just happened. He got the job. He actually got the job. His hands were still shaking when he opened his laptop to check his email. Patricia had already sent the offer letter. Daniel clicked it open and started reading. The salary number made him blink. He read it again to make sure he hadn't misread the decimal point. It was more than double what he'd expected for an entry-level position. It was more than his mother made in a year working 2 jobs. But as he scrolled down, Daniel noticed something that made him pause. This wasn't the analyst position he'd applied for. The title was different. Leadership Development Program Associate. He kept reading. The Leadership Development Program was apparently a special track, only offered to a handful of candidates each year. It included rotations through different departments, direct mentorship from senior partners, and accelerated advancement opportunities. Daniel had never heard of this program. It hadn't been mentioned in the job posting he'd applied to. Why were they offering it to him? His phone rang again. Another unknown number. "Hello? Daniel, it's James Wellington." Daniel sat down on his bed, his legs suddenly feeling weak. "Mr. Wellington, hi. I hope Patricia's call didn't come as too much of a shock." Yes, It's great news. Thank you. You earned it. Your interview was strong, your case study analysis was excellent, and the entire panel agreed you'd be a good fit for our firm. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate the opportunity. But I imagine you're wondering about the leadership development program. It did seem different from what I applied for. James was quiet for a moment. Can I be frank with you, Daniel? Of course, Daniel said, holding his breath. That morning in the coffee shop when you paid for my coffee, I was having one of those days where everything was going wrong. I'd been up since 4 dealing with a client crisis in Asia. I'd rushed out of the house without breakfast. I'd forgotten my wallet in my office, which never happens. I was stressed, frustrated, running late for an important meeting, and feeling like I was losing control of my day. Daniel listened, not sure where this was going. And then you did something kind, James continued. Not because you knew who I was or what it might get you. You had no idea. I could see from your clothes, from the way you counted your change, that $6 meant something to you. But you gave it anyway. It was just coffee, Daniel said softly. That's where you're wrong. It wasn't just coffee. It was a choice. A choice that revealed your character. James paused. Do you know what the biggest problem is in business today, Daniel? It's not lack of skills or knowledge. We can teach those things. The problem is finding people with integrity. People who do the right thing even when it costs them something. People who treat others with respect regardless of who they are or what they can offer in return. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. When you walked into that interview room and I saw it was you, I'll admit I was surprised. But then I watched you handle that surprise with grace. You didn't try to use our earlier encounter to your advantage. You didn't mention it or act like we were buddies. You just sat down and did your best to answer our questions professionally. That impressed me even more than the coffee had. I didn't know what else to do, Daniel admitted. Exactly. You defaulted to professionalism and honesty. Those are the things I can't teach. The rest, the skills you'll need, the knowledge about our industry, our methods, our clients, all of that we can teach you. But who you are as a person, that was already there. Daniel didn't know what to say. His throat felt tight. The leadership development program is something we reserve for candidates who we believe have potential beyond just being good analysts. We're looking for future leaders of this firm, people who will carry forward the values that matter to us. After talking with my team, we all agreed you fit that description. I don't know what to say, Mr. Wellington. Thank you doesn't seem like enough. Just James is fine. And you don't need to say anything. Just accept the offer and show up ready to work hard in July. I will. I promise. After James hung up, Daniel sat on his bed for a long time, just staring at the wall. Then he started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, but real, deep laughter that came from somewhere in his chest. The kind of laughter that turns into tears. He'd done it. Against all odds, despite his worn suit and his empty bank account and his cheap apartment, he'd done it. His phone buzzed with a text. It was his mom. How did your interview go last week? I've been meaning to ask, but work has been crazy. Daniel called her immediately. Mom, I got it. I got the job. He heard her gasp. Daniel, oh baby, that's wonderful. Tell me everything. He told her about the interview, about the offer, about the salary. He left out the part about the coffee shop for now. That was a story for when he could tell it in person. I'm so proud of you, his mom said, and Daniel could hear she was crying. I knew you could do it. I always knew. I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. All those sacrifices you made, working those extra shifts so I could stay in school. Stop. That was my choice. My joy. You're going to do amazing things, Daniel. I've always known that. After they hung up, Daniel called his sister. Then he texted his roommate. Then he just sat there, letting it all sink in. The next few months passed in a blur. Daniel finished his finals, walked at graduation, and prepared for his new job. He bought his first real suit. A nice one this time, using money from the signing bonus Wellington and Associates had included in his offer package. His first day at the firm was in mid-July. Daniel arrived early, nervous and excited. The receptionist, the same woman who'd checked him in for his interview, smiled when she saw him. Welcome to the team, Daniel. James asked that you come to his office first thing. Daniel's stomach flipped. Was something wrong? Had they changed their minds? But when he reached James's office, the CEO was smiling. Daniel, welcome. Come in, sit down. James's office was impressive but not ostentatious. Awards and photos lined the walls, but the space felt professional rather than showy. How are you feeling? First day jitters? A little, Daniel admitted. Okay, a lot, James laughed. That's normal. Listen, I wanted to talk to you before you get swept up in orientation and training. I'm going to be your primary mentor during your time in the leadership development program. But you're the CEO. Don't you have, I don't know, 1,000 more important things to do? This is important. Developing the next generation of leaders is the most important thing I do. I mentor 2 or 3 people in the program personally each year. This year, you're one of them. I'm honored, sir. James, I mean. We'll meet weekly, sometimes more often if needed. I'll guide you through your rotations, introduce you to key clients, help you navigate the firm. But more than that, I want to help you develop your own leadership philosophy, the kind of leader you want to be. Over the following months, Daniel threw himself into his work. He rotated through different departments, learning the firm's methods, working on real client projects, absorbing everything he could. The work was challenging, sometimes overwhelming, but he loved it. And true to his word, James met with him every week. Sometimes they talked about specific projects Daniel was working on. Sometimes they discussed broader business strategy. And sometimes they talked about life, about values, about what it meant to lead with integrity. You know what I've noticed about you? James said during one of their meetings about 6 months into Daniel's tenure. You still treat everyone the same way. The receptionist, the janitor, the senior partners. You're respectful and kind to everyone. Shouldn't everyone do that? They should. But most people don't. Most people treat others based on what they think that person can do for them. You treat people like they're human beings who deserve respect, period. Don't lose that as you advance in your career. Daniel thought about his mom, about growing up watching her come home exhausted from being treated like she was invisible by people who thought they were better than her. I won't, he said. The years that followed weren't always easy. Daniel worked long hours, faced steep learning curves, made mistakes and learned from them. But he also thrived. His projects impressed clients. His team members respected him. His mentors saw his potential. By his 3rd year, Daniel had been promoted to senior consultant, leapfrogging several of his peers. By year 5, he was leading major projects on his own. By year 7, he made partner, one of the youngest in the firm's history. But more than his career success, Daniel never forgot where he came from. He started a mentorship program at his old university, working with students from low-income backgrounds. He made sure the firm recruited from a wider range of schools, not just the elite universities. He pushed for more generous financial aid in their internship programs so students who couldn't afford to work unpaid could still gain experience. And he sent money home every month. Not a lot at first, just a few $100s. But as his salary increased, so did the amount. He paid off his mother's medical bills. He helped his sister with college tuition. He bought his mom a car so she wouldn't have to take 2 buses to get to work anymore. 8 years after that morning in the coffee shop, Daniel sat in his own office at Wellington and Associates. Not James's office, obviously, but a nice one with a window and real furniture and his name on the door. His assistant knocked and poked her head in. Your 11 o'clock is here. The student from State University for the informational interview? Great, send them in. A young woman walked in, probably 21 or 22, wearing a suit that was clearly too big for her and looked like it came from a thrift store. She clutched her folder nervously. Hi, I'm Daniel Chen, he said, standing and extending his hand. Thanks for coming in. Thank you so much for meeting with me, Mr. Chen. I know you must be really busy. Please, just Daniel. And I'm never too busy to talk with someone who's trying to break into the industry. Have a seat.